The spring of 1865. The Civil War is over. 4 years of the bloodiest fighting this country had ever seen. More than 620,000 dead, hundreds of thousands more who came home with limbs missing, wounds that wouldn't close, pain that didn't stop. The surgeons did what they could. They injected morphine, every 4 hours in some cases, for weeks, for months. When those soldiers walked off the trains and back into their towns in Ohio and Virginia and Pennsylvania, a lot of them had something around their necks. A leather thong, a small bag. Inside it, a vial of morphine sulfate tablets and a hypodermic syringe. That was all the army gave them. No treatment, no support, no warning. Roughly 400,000 veterans came home addicted to morphine. So many that the condition got its own name. They called it the soldier's disease. What happened next took 160 years to fully play out. And the last chapter of that story, the part that costs Americans over $1 trillion a decade, is still being written right now. Here is the story. Before there was morphine, there was a plant. Before the plant, there was pain. And before any of it, there was a young man working night shifts in a pharmacy in Paderborn, Germany, bored out of his mind, running experiments on a substance nobody fully understood yet. His name was Friedrich Sertürner. He was 20 years old. He was a pharmacist's apprentice, not a scientist, not a professor, not someone the world was watching, but sometime around 1803 and 1804, working alone in the back of a small-town apothecary with whatever equipment he could get his hands on, he dissolved raw opium in acid and neutralized it with ammonia. What precipitated out of that solution was something the world had never isolated before, a pure crystalline alkaloid, white and powdery, with properties that no one had ever been able to measure or control with opium itself. He tested it on dogs. One of them died. He tested it on himself and 3 teenage volunteers, administering large doses of the compound and recording what happened. The euphoria was intense. The sedation was complete. The nausea afterward was severe. Sertürner himself ended up addicted to the substance in the course of his own research, which tells you something important about what he had found. He named it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. People were working with this plant, opium, from the dried latex of the poppy Papaver somniferum, more than 3,400 years before the United States existed as a country. The Sumerians of Lower Mesopotamia called the opium poppy the hulgil, the joy plant, around 3400 BC. They passed the knowledge to the Assyrians. The Assyrians passed it to the Babylonians. The Egyptians were cultivating it in the fields of Thebes by 1300 BC. When Alexander the Great marched his armies east into India around 326 BC, one of his officers sent back reports describing a reed that produced honey without bees. The sweetness of raw opium juice, tasted for the first time. The Romans used it as medicine and recreation alike. Arab physicians during the Islamic Golden Age refined the extraction techniques and spread opium across the known world through trade routes that stretched further than the distance from New York to Los Angeles and back twice over. Opium worked. That was never in question. It killed pain in a way that nothing else in the ancient world could. But it was imprecise, unpredictable, and dangerous. A batch of raw opium could vary wildly in potency. Dose the same patient, the same amount on 2 different days, and the effects could be completely different. Physicians had been trying for centuries to understand what they were actually giving people. Sertürner cracked it. Morphine was the active ingredient, the engine inside the machine. His discovery sat largely unnoticed for more than a decade. The medical establishment was skeptical. A teenage pharmacy apprentice hadn't done his work in a university lab, and the scientific community of 1805 had a habit of ignoring people who weren't already credentialed. But by 1818, Sertürner was internationally recognized. In 1827, a small pharmaceutical company in Darmstadt, Germany, became the first to manufacture morphine commercially at scale. That company was Merck & Company. You know their name today as Merck, one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations in the world. Morphine wasn't just their first major product, it was the product that built them. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. For the next 2 decades, morphine spread through the medical world with the kind of confidence that only comes from something that really does work. Physicians called it God's own medicine. It stopped pain immediately and completely. It calmed patients in surgical crises. It made the unbearable bearable. And unlike raw opium, morphine could be dosed precisely. You knew how much you were giving, and you could be reasonably sure of the effect. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shaped the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between, I always want to know. There was one practical problem with morphine in its early years. Taken orally, it was slow. The intestinal walls metabolized much of it before it reached the bloodstream. The effect was real but muted, delayed by an hour or more, unpredictable in its timing. For a surgeon trying to manage a patient's pain during a procedure, that wasn't good enough. In the early 1850s, Scottish physician Alexander Wood refined the design of the hypodermic syringe, a hollow needle through which a liquid could be injected directly beneath the skin. Wood discovered that morphine delivered this way acted almost instantly. The bloodstream absorbed it without the metabolic delay of the gut. The dose required was a fraction of what oral administration demanded. He was also the first recorded person to become addicted to injected morphine. His wife was the second. That detail didn't slow anything down. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, the US Army had morphine sulfate and was beginning to distribute hypodermic syringes to field surgeons. The Union forces alone procured approximately 175,000 pounds of opium and morphine preparations over the course of the war. 2,000 hypodermic syringes were issued to military medical units, a technology so new that most physicians on both sides of the conflict had only just encountered it. The battlefield injuries of the Civil War were unlike anything American medicine had been asked to manage before. The Minié ball, the standard rifle bullet of the era, shattered bones rather than piercing them cleanly. The standard treatment for a shattered limb was amputation, quickly, if possible, before gangrene set in. A field hospital in the Civil War was a place of constant screaming, of sores and chloroform, and men begging for something, anything, to make it stop. Morphine made it stop. Surgeons injected it preoperatively. They injected it postoperatively. They gave it to men suffering from dysentery, which was killing more soldiers than bullets were. The conventional wisdom of the time, the only wisdom available really, was to give morphine until the patient was comfortable and keep giving it until they weren't in pain anymore. There were no standardized dosage guidelines. There were no addiction protocols. There was barely an understanding at the clinical level that the body was building physical tolerance with every injection. So soldiers received morphine every 4 hours, for weeks, for months. Some were still receiving it when the war ended. The mortality statistics from the Civil War are staggering on their own terms. Roughly 2% of the entire American population died in 4 years of fighting, which would be the equivalent of losing more than 7 million Americans today. But the addiction crisis that followed the war was a different kind of casualty. Quieter and slower and invisible to the history books that focused on troop movements and political outcomes. An estimated 400,000 veterans, soldiers from both the Union and the Confederacy, came home physically dependent on morphine. That number is larger than the entire current population of Miami, Florida. They came home to towns and farms with no treatment infrastructure, no understanding of what dependency actually was, and no support from a government that had never imagined this problem. The Army issued each addicted soldier a small supply of morphine and a syringe upon discharge, with the practical logic that they were going to need it, and nothing else. These men were identified in the years that followed by the leather bag they wore around their necks. Inside, their medicine. Outside, no path back. The term soldier's disease entered the American vocabulary, and the country moved on the way countries do. The addiction problem was real, documented, and widely known in American medical literature by the 1880s. Physicians had been arguing about it in journals for years. Morphine addiction was understood to be a consequence of extended use. The question the medical community wanted answered, desperately, with the urgency that only a product that's genuinely profitable can create, was, is there a morphine-like substance without the dependency risk? The answer they thought they had found arrived from Germany in 1898. Felix Hoffmann was a chemist at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Elberfeld. In the space of 11 days in the summer of 1897, he synthesized two compounds that would change the world. The first was a modified version of salicylic acid from the willow tree. Bayer marketed it under the name aspirin. The second was an acetylated form of morphine that had been chemically modified to pass more quickly through the blood-brain barrier, delivering its payload faster and more completely than the original compound. In trials on Bayer employees, workers described feeling almost superhuman. Heroic, they said. In German, heroisch. Bayer named it heroin. They launched it commercially in 1898, 11 days after aspirin, as it happens, and marketed it explicitly as a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine. Their claim was not cynical deception, at least not at first. The early clinical trials genuinely appeared to show fewer adverse effects. Heroin suppressed the cough reflex spectacularly, which made it attractive as a treatment for tuberculosis, pneumonia, and any other respiratory illness, which, in 1898, meant a huge portion of the patient population. Bayer sent free samples to physicians across the United States. The St. James Society, a philanthropic organization, launched a campaign to mail free heroin to morphine addicts who wanted to quit. The logic was sincere: treat one addiction with a safer substitute. Quick question: how many Americans do you think were already addicted to opioids, legally prescribed opioids, before the 20th century even began? Drop your guess in the comments. By the early 1900s, physicians were starting to notice the problem. Patients prescribed heroin for coughs were showing up needing higher and higher doses. The withdrawal from heroin, they were realizing, was every bit as severe as withdrawal from morphine, possibly worse. A handful of doctors published warnings as early as 1899. They were largely ignored. The market was too good. Heroin turned out to be roughly 2 to 3 times more potent than morphine by weight, because it metabolizes into morphine faster and more completely once it's in the body. It wasn't a safer substitute. It was a faster acting, more addictive version of the exact same drug. Every morphine addict who switched to heroin to get clean was exchanging one dependency for a deeper one. Bayer quietly stopped producing heroin commercially in 1913. By then, the damage was done. By 1914, the opioid problem in the United States had reached a scale that demanded federal action. A 1911 study estimated that at least 2/3 of the opiate addicts in the country were women, many of them patients who had been prescribed morphine or laudanum by physicians for everything from menstrual pain to nervous exhaustion, treatments that were routine and considered appropriate. The over-the-counter patent medicine industry had spent decades embedding opiates in tonics, elixirs, and cough syrups sold without a prescription at any drugstore in America. Some of these products were given to children. Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Act in December 1914. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. The act required anyone who manufactured, distributed, or prescribed opiates to register with the Internal Revenue Service and pay a tax. Its language was careful. It was framed as a revenue measure, not an outright ban. But the courts interpreted it as effectively criminalizing the prescription of opiates to maintain addiction. Overnight, physicians who had been treating addicted patients with carefully managed maintenance doses found themselves legally exposed. The addicts those patients became were no longer patients in the eyes of the law. They were criminals. New York Medical Journal observed at the time that the immediate effects of the law were seen in the flocking of drug addicts to hospitals and sanatoriums, alongside a wave of desperate crimes committed by people in withdrawal who could no longer access legal supplies. By 1923, Congress banned all legal narcotics sales entirely. The black market didn't appear, it was already there, waiting. For most of the mid-20th century, morphine and its derivatives were tightly controlled. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, established in 1930, treated addiction primarily as a law enforcement problem. Opioids remained in medical use. Morphine was essential in surgical settings, in cancer care, in end-of-life pain management. But the era of casual prescription, of mail-order heroin and over-the-counter laudanum was over. The medical profession had also developed what you might call a healthy terror of opioids. Decades of seeing addiction up close, in veterans, in chronic pain patients, in people who had never meant to become dependent, had made physicians cautious to the point of undertreatment. By the 1980s, there was growing evidence that cancer patients and surgical patients were being under-medicated for pain, suffering unnecessarily because their doctors were afraid of the dependency risk. A small but vocal movement in palliative care began arguing that opioids were being withheld from people who genuinely needed them. That argument was correct. The suffering it described was real. The solution that came next was not. In 1996, a pharmaceutical company based in Stamford, Connecticut launched a new drug. The company was Purdue Pharma. The drug was OxyContin, a time-release formulation of oxycodone, an opioid that had existed since the 1910s. The innovation Purdue claimed was the 12-hour release mechanism. One pill every 12 hours, providing steady pain relief without the peaks and valleys of shorter-acting opioids. The pitch to the medical community was that this steady-state delivery made OxyContin less prone to the kind of euphoric rush that created addiction. They had sales data to back this up. What they didn't share was what they knew. Internal Purdue documents obtained through litigation and later confirmed under oath in a 2015 deposition by Richard Sackler, who served as Purdue's president and co-chairman of the board, show that the company was aware of a crucial fact from the beginning. OxyContin's active ingredient, oxycodone, is roughly twice as potent as morphine by weight. Twice. Not the same, not similar, twice as powerful. Many physicians in 1996 believed, based on clinical intuition, that oxycodone was actually weaker than morphine. That misperception was boosting prescriptions. In May 1997, 1 year after launch, Purdue's head of sales and marketing, Michael Friedman, wrote directly to Richard Sackler, "We are well aware of the view held by many physicians that oxycodone is weaker than morphine. I do not plan to do anything about that. It would be extremely dangerous at this early stage in the life of the product to make physicians think the drug is stronger or equal to morphine." Richard Sackler's reply, "I agree with you. This is the part that should make you angry." Purdue sent armies of sales representatives into physicians' offices across the country, more than 600 reps at the peak, with a message that OxyContin was safer than other opioids, that its time-release formula reduced addiction risk, and that a scientific paper in the New England Journal of Medicine had established that fewer than 1% of patients who took opioids for pain became addicted. That paper was a 5-sentence letter to the editor, not a clinical study. Purdue cited it thousands of times. They paid doctors to attend luxury conferences where opioid prescribing was promoted. They funded patient advocacy groups that lobbied for broader opioid prescribing. They targeted primary care physicians, family doctors who had little training in addiction medicine, in counties and states across the country. Within 4 years of launch, OxyContin was generating over $1 billion a year in sales. In 2001, when a federal prosecutor reported 59 deaths from OxyContin in a single state, Richard Sackler wrote to Purdue executives, "This is not too bad." In 2007, 3 Purdue executives pleaded guilty in federal court to misbranding OxyContin, admitting the company had misled regulators and the public about the drug's addiction risk. Purdue paid $600 million in fines and penalties, one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in US history at that time. In the same years that fine was being paid, the Sackler family withdrew an estimated $10 billion from Purdue's revenues for personal use. The $600 million was a cost of doing business, and business continued. The playbook Purdue used in the 1990s wasn't new. It was one of the oldest moves in the American pharmaceutical industry. In 1898, Bayer had marketed heroin as a non-addictive alternative to morphine, even though heroin metabolizes into morphine and is more addictive than the original. A century later, Purdue marketed OxyContin as a less addictive alternative to short-acting opioids, even though its 12-hour pills could be crushed to release the entire dose at once. Something that became widespread immediately after launch, and that Purdue's internal reports documented. Patrick Radden Keefe, whose book on the Sackler family was the definitive account of the crisis, described an internal Purdue report from as early as 1999 that showed the company knew OxyContin was being crushed and snorted in rural communities. They responded by increasing their marketing in those areas. The FDA, for its part, approved OxyContin's original label, a label that, critics later argued, dramatically understated the addiction risk. The revolving door between pharmaceutical industry and regulatory agencies was well-oiled. Senior FDA officials moved to pharmaceutical consulting roles. Pharmaceutical executives served on FDA advisory panels. The agency that was supposed to protect American consumers was, at minimum, deeply entangled with the industry it regulated. This wasn't a foreign problem that arrived on American shores. It was built in American boardrooms, by American lawyers, filed with American regulators, and sold to American doctors, in American cities, to American patients. The consequences landed in rural Ohio, in West Virginia hollows, in small towns in New Hampshire and Maine and Kentucky. Between 1999 and 2024, more than 700,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. The vast majority involved opioids. The opioid epidemic that OxyContin helped ignite didn't stay in one category. Patients who became dependent on OxyContin switched to heroin when prescriptions were cut off, cheaper and available on the street. Then fentanyl entered the illicit supply in the 2010s, 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, manufactured in labs and smuggled in quantities small enough to be invisible to inspectors. The third wave of the epidemic, fentanyl deaths, killed more than 70,000 Americans in 2023 alone. More than 8.6 million Americans reported misusing prescription opioids in 2023, according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. That number doesn't count the millions more who moved to illicit alternatives. The economic cost of the opioid epidemic has been estimated at well over $1 trillion over the past 2 decades in healthcare costs, criminal justice, lost productivity, and social services. The family that built the empire from OxyContin settled with 55 state attorneys general and U.S. territories in 2025 for $7.4 billion, the largest settlement of its kind against individuals responsible for contributing to the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma knew. 1997. They knew. And they kept going for 2 more decades. While Americans paid the price in lives, in dollars, and in communities that have not recovered yet. Morphine itself, the original compound, the one Sertürner isolated in that pharmacy in Germany in 1804, is still being manufactured, legally, in controlled quantities, and used every day in American hospitals. If you've had major surgery in this country, there is a very good chance morphine touched your bloodstream at some point during your recovery. It remains the gold standard for severe acute pain management in surgical settings, in trauma care, and in end-of-life hospice treatment. The American Society of Anesthesiologists still lists it as a foundational analgesic. More than 13,000 Americans died from prescription opioid overdoses in 2023, according to the CDC. Drugs like oxycodone, hydrocodone, and morphine itself. That number is lower than its 2017 peak of 17,000, but it is not zero. It has never been close to zero. The prescription opioid section at your local CVS is legal. The drugs on it are FDA approved. Some of them trace their chemical lineage directly to Sertürner's white powder, to the syringes in Civil War field hospitals, to the leather bags around veterans' necks in 1865. The molecular structure of oxycodone is a direct modification of morphine, hydrocodone, fentanyl, oxymorphone. All of them are engineered variations on the same base compound, refinements and escalations of a molecule that an unknown German apprentice isolated in a back room more than 220 years ago. You will find opioids in the controlled substance, safe behind the pharmacy counter at Walmart, at Walgreens, at your neighborhood hospital. You'll find them in hospice facilities caring for the dying, which is an entirely appropriate place for them. You'll find them in the medicine cabinets of Americans managing cancer pain, chronic pain from injuries, post-surgical recovery. People who depend on them, appropriately, under careful medical supervision. And you'll find them in the statistics that the CDC publishes every year, the numbers that have declined since their peak, but have not fallen to anywhere near where they were before 1996. Here's what morphine's full story actually tells you. It tells you that a molecule can be genuine medicine and genuine catastrophe at the same time. Morphine saved millions of lives. It allowed surgery to become survivable at scale. It let people die with dignity instead of screaming in agony. None of that is fiction. None of it should be taken away. It also created the first American opioid epidemic in 1865, was temporarily replaced by a supposedly safer drug that was even more addictive, was regulated into the black market, re-emerged in pharmaceutical form in the 1990s under a different name with the same playbook, and has killed more Americans in the last 25 years than the entire Vietnam War. Every year, compounding. The pattern repeated not because of ignorance. It repeated because the pattern was profitable. Every step of this story, Merck building a company on morphine, Bayer marketing heroin as a cure, Purdue marketing OxyContin as safe, and every step in between, involved people who understood what they were selling. The playbook didn't change in 220 years. Sell the miracle, minimize the risk, wait until the consequences are someone else's problem. Then, sell the antidote. How many things in your life right now were built on a decision someone made in a boardroom that you never got to vote on? Have you ever checked what's in your medicine cabinet and wondered how it got there? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that run your life, subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this work is worth doing. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm something honest found an audience. And share this with someone who thinks they already know how the opioid crisis started. The next time you hand a prescription to a pharmacist at CVS or Walgreens, or the next time you hear about another overdose death in your state, you'll know the full length of the rope. It goes back to a German apothecary in 1804, through Civil War field hospitals and Bayer's marketing department, and a boardroom in Stamford, Connecticut. And it ends right here, in a country that has never fully reckoned with the fact that we have done this to ourselves. Twice, 3 times, and counting. That's not a coincidence. That's a business model, and we're still paying for it.